A Shapeshifter Tried to Steal My Life. Written by Ask Dude. To this day, I'm not sure if it really happened. The memories seem more like dreams than real events. They don't feel as lucid as other parts of my childhood, like birthdays and sleepovers with my friends, or bruises and broken ice cream cones. It's more like a series of vague recollections, buried somewhere deep in my subconscious. I forget them for years at a time, only for them to resurface as fleeting thoughts that slip away as I try to hold on to them. I'm left with only an eerie aftertaste, which I quickly forget about as I go about my daily business. That's why I've decided to finally write it down, to immortalize it on paper while it slowly dies in my mind. For all I know, it could have just been a figment of my imagination. But the scars on my forearm say otherwise. I don't remember when it started or how long it lasted, but I must have been around 6 or 7 years old, as I had just started going to primary school. I was returning home for dinner after hours of running around with my friends. As I walked in and sat down at the table, I was asked the obligatory questions about how my day had been. Excited about my recent playground adventures, I started recounting the tales of the mountains that I had climbed and the monsters I had fought with my friends. And just before dinner time had come and ruined it all. "That must have been a short adventure," responded my father indifferently, "because I saw you walking about the house a quarter hour ago." This perplexed me. Although, being a bit of a slow learner, I hadn't figured out how to read the clock yet. I was sure that we had spent more time playing than that. Even though this was very strange, I shrugged it off without saying anything else to my parents. And I thought that was the end of it. But it kept happening. It was just small things at the beginning, barely significant enough to notice. Sometimes my mom would talk about things that I knew I hadn't done, like how apparently I had been mean to my younger brother the other day, when I was sure that I had spent that day in my room playing video games, or when I had eaten all the cake. Though I clearly remembered the disappointment when I had come home from school to find an empty tray with nothing but crumbs. This would all go on for some time, and even though I had found it unfair that I would get blamed for all these things that never happened, my word just didn't hold up to the authority of my parents. My mind would get distracted with more interesting things anyway, and all of these ominous events turned to nothing but afterthoughts. That is, until I discovered the source of my unjust accusations. One late evening, after returning home from some sport I have long forgotten about, I saw through the window a fourth figure sitting at my regular seat at the dinner table, together with my parents and my brother. Something seemed familiar about the outline of the person, but I couldn't put my finger on just what it was. Thinking that this silhouette in the dim, warm light of the house was just one of my brother's friends visiting, I casually walked the rest of the way to the house. Just as I passed the window to get to the front door, I heard the creak of a chair getting pushed away from the table, and through the corner of my eye, I glimpsed the unknown guest standing up and walking to the back of the house. Goosebumps raised across my skin and a cold feeling crawled up my spine. Even though I had only seen the person for a fraction of a second, less than enough time to make out any discernible features, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I quickly made it the rest of the way into my family, and I tried to satisfy my curiosity by asking who the visitor was. "What visitor?" My mother's answer was less than acceptable. "The one that just stood up," I said, raising my voice. "Sweetie, there isn't anyone home but us," replied my mother with a nervous smile. My guts had been right. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. I tried to mutter some sort of reply, but I only managed to produce confused mumbles. With a but he was just... I reluctantly decided to investigate myself. I slowly walked into the hallway where the phantom had disappeared. Nothing. With the same caution as before, I checked the bathroom and every other room, which all turned out to be equally empty, all except the basement. I had purposefully left it for last because of my fear of the dark. Our basement was just a normal one, with storage shelves, some training equipment, and a freezer. But to 6-year-old me, it was the scariest place that I could imagine. Standing before the descending stairs, the dark doorway seemed like a gaping abyss. I breathed in and readied myself for the wall of darkness I had to go through to reach the light switch. But as I took my first step, I sensed a motion to my left. My heart leapt into my throat and I turned around startled. I gasped loudly at the sight that met me. A corgi. I was as surprised as I was confused. We've never had a dog before. The small creature looked at me for a few seconds. Its otherwise innocent face and eyes, like black marbles, looked at me with an unconcerned expression, devoid of the usual energy and curiosity that you would expect from a dog. After a moment of silence, it turned towards the basement door and clattered down the stairs, disappearing into the void. "Mom?" I yelled without taking my eyes away from the basement. "When did we get a dog?" "We've always had a dog," it echoed from the kitchen. "Come and sit down again, you haven't eaten up." Always had a dog. Sit down again? I hadn't sat down yet since coming home, let alone had I started eating. And we had never owned a dog. This was all just too much for me to process. So I slowly backed out of the hallway before turning around and running as soon as the basement was out of my sight. I quietly sat down at the dinner table where a half-eaten plate of pasta was laying at my seat. If I had been older, I could have asked more questions about the dog and the guest. But I was a quiet kid, and my previous attempts at addressing any of this had proven fruitless. I sat through the rest of dinner without eating anything. My appetite disappeared looking at the half-eaten portion of pasta that the enigmatic figure had left behind. I went to bed early, right after dinner, and I slept uneasily through the night. The figure, the dog, the weird comments from my mom, all kept circulating through my head, making falling fully asleep impossible. I woke up to the sound of birds chirping and the sun shining through the window curtains. I sighed with relief. Maybe it had all been a bad dream. The surrealness of it all made it hard for me to believe that it had really happened. This false safety that dawn had brought was, however, shattered the moment I stood up. In the doorway, which I explicitly remember closing, stood the corgi, and it stared at me. The evening's events had actually happened. Anger flushed through me. Why are you here, you stupid dog?" I snarled childishly and turned around to my wardrobe, not expecting an answer from an animal.
"I'm going to steal your life."
I froze on the spot. The sinister voice had been unmistakably my own. The same spine-crawling feeling of fear that I felt when I saw the fourth occupant at the dinner table returned to me. It was like waking up from a nightmare only to realize you were still sleeping and had just entered a new one. I spun around quickly, ready to jump whatever this thing was. As I took off towards my adversary, I realized that it wasn't a dog standing in front of me anymore. It was a carbon copy of myself, boasting a menacing grin. This both horrified me and fueled my anger. Where I the night before had fled, a streak of adrenaline gave me the confidence to stand my ground. I charged the clone, I wrestled it to the ground, and I exerted all the force that I could manage to pin it down. And just as it seemed I would win the fight, the weight under me instantly disappeared. Before I could fully register what had happened, the chubby corgi slipped out from under me and fled into the hallway. I don't recall if I already fully understood what was happening at that moment. I definitely knew it to some extent. Any adult would have been dumbfounded, but a child's mind works differently. It can make a connection in places a mature brain would gloss over or discard as impossible. Even if I hadn't figured it exactly out yet, I would in the coming days. The dog, the figure, and my supernatural doppelganger was one and the same. Some sort of shape-shifting entity trying to pose as me when I wasn't present. It wasn't faultless, but almost. Sometimes I could catch it off guard by pretending to leave, only to hide in the hallway and wait for it to appear from the shadowy depths of the basement, usually in the form of myself. I would try to catch it and apprehend it while calling for my parents. But as soon as they came in, it had morphed into something else. Sometimes the dog, sometimes my brother, always appropriately crying or whining, making my parents think that I was just throwing a tantrum. However, the moment that my parents weren't around anymore, it would drop the charade, and its visage would change into a mockingly debonair grin, letting me know that I hadn't won the battle. I don't know for how long it continued to go on. Weeks, months, maybe even years. I turned increasingly violent and paranoid. I would lash out at friends and family, thinking that they were the tormenting charlatan. Sometimes I realized I had been wrong. Other times I was met with that all too familiar telltale smile. Whenever I thought that I was finally about to expose it, it would either in the blink of an eye change its shape, or it would retreat into the basement when that wasn't an option. My parents tried in vain to send me to therapy and anger management, but I knew that the moment I gave up would be the moment that I lost my life to the Shapeshifter. One fateful evening when I was home alone, I finally managed to corner it. With no parents home, it couldn't pretend to be my brother or the dog being bullied by me and seeking help. I wanted it gone, and I wanted it out of my life. But I wanted answers even more. "What are you and why do you want my life?" I yelled desperately.
"You wouldn't understand who I am or where I come from. But that doesn't matter. You'll see soon enough. It's a dark place down there, beneath the floorboards. Once I have your life and your memories, you'll be the one trapped down there."
For the first time, I saw a hint of sorrow in its otherwise evil smile.
"Then I can forget about it and lead a normal life."
This was the last straw. I couldn't take it anymore, and all the pent-up anger in me started to boil over. At first, it turned into the dog and tried to flee, but I grabbed its hind legs and smashed it into the wall with a hollow thud. This seemed to stun it for a moment because I managed to pick it up and started dragging it towards the basement door. As soon as it realized where I was taking it, it started frantically kicking and biting, trying to get free. But I just held on tighter, despite the retaliation. The closer we got, the more panicked its movements became. It started rapidly morphing from one form to another. This time I could see the otherwise almost instant metamorphosis. How its skin started almost boiling before bloating into a new shape. It didn't seem to be able to take a form bigger than a child, but its face jumped between all of my family members, and even to ones that I hadn't seen before. I kept strangling it as I dragged it inch by inch, repeatedly hitting it as hard as I could whenever I could spare a free hand. Just before the door, its fingers morphed into claws that dug deep into my forearm. I winced in pain, but gathered the strength to throw it against the wall, hard enough to hear a bone crack. Before I threw it down the basement stairs, it begged one last time.
"Please don't send me down. I beg you, please, please, please."
But I didn't listen. I picked up the mangled body and kicked it down the stairs. I slammed the door and locked it up. I don't remember what happened afterwards. No more incidents happened, and the dog disappeared, so my attack must have worked. The gaping wounds I had gotten were blamed on the dog. "Whose idea was it to get that dog anyway? We're lucky it ran away," my father had said. "To be honest, I don't even know when we got it," replied my mom, for the first time acknowledging something strange had been going on. Anyway, life returned to the usual. My wounds healed and turned into faded scars, and I forgot about it all. That's all that I can recall of the events. Or almost all. There are other, even more faint memories, darker and more uncommon, ones that only visit me in the silence of the night, when sounds can't drown out these obscure recollections. They are of a dark and damp place, of crawling up cold cliffs and sharp rocks, of seeing the warm light of a well-lit home through the cracks of the floorboards, and of the desire to take what was never mine to begin with.